Right. So you first thought about your themes, and hopefully you found one or two themes that you think you might want to write about. For example, we'll use an example. Your theme could be revenge. So you've got your theme. You want to write about revenge. Sorry, I'm doing the wrong sign. Or revenge. That's great. And then you thought about some films that you love and the reason why you love those films. Maybe it might be character or something else you might like, which is great. Okay, so you have two important elements. You want to do revenge as a theme, and you love films which have strong characters. You have both those elements. Fantastic. Now, I want you to think about character. When you watch a film, really, you're experiencing the world through that person, through that character. In a book, when you're reading about a character, you can get fully absorbed in a character because you can understand their feelings and thoughts. And that makes it easier for you to empathise with that character. But in a film, it's slightly different. It's more visual. You don't hear their thoughts and feelings. It's a visual art. So therefore, what makes good character in film and what makes bad character then? Really, character in film, there are two sides to character, two elements to it. The first element we call external character. So in an audience or in a cinema watching a movie, it's what we see on the screen. So for example, in a cowboy movie, you see a cool character maybe, with a lot of self-control and very tough. And how do you see that? How do you know these things about him? Because maybe he walks into a bar and he has a shootout with someone and beats some baddies up, without without it bothering him much. You've got his face, you've got the way he dresses, and you can identify him. Oh, he's a tough character. That's his external characterization. That's what we see. But also there's the other side to that. Something we call the internal character. What's he feeling? And it's really important because we, the audience, need to relate to that character. And we need to understand what he's feeling. With a movie, it's difficult to show those emotions. You could show them via crying or them getting angry. You can see that externally. But it's important, the inside characteristics are really important. And it's important also in any story to have conflict. You couldn't have a cowboy film without conflict, could you? Imagine he rides into town on his horse and everybody's nice and friendly and they say hello to him. And everybody's waving at each other and then he leaves town. That would be a very boring film. But if there's somebody in town that doesn't like his face and wants to have a shootout with him, our character now has to defend himself, and he needs to fight and have a conflict in order to win. And you have to have a conflict in any story. If you go back through history, even as a child, the stories you're told as a child, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, there's conflict there. There's two characters that want different things or at cross purposes, or they want the same thing. So with Goldilocks, she goes into the person's house, she goes into the bear's house, she wants to sit down, she wants to eat breakfast, and she wants to go to sleep. But it's the Three Bears' house. So when they come back, they're angry, and that anger creates conflict. So your character, the one that you've identified with, are going to be put in a situation which is dangerous, and the risk is their lives. So there's a conflict there, which means it creates tension in the viewers. So every story has conflict, which means that your story needs to have a character who goes through conflict. The characters can be either protagonists or antagonist. So a protagonist or an antagonist. The protagonist is the main character of your story. He's or she's the character that your audience relate to. Think about Lord of the Rings. Frodo Baggins is the protagonist. You see the world of Lord of the Rings through him. He's like us. He's kind of boring English character. But then, when adventure arrives, he needs to decide whether he's going to go or stay at home. And he decides to go. And then we see the story through this character. You know he's not very good at sword fighting, so because you've related to him, you think, oh gosh, he's in some danger here. And he's a good protagonist. Because when he's fighting for the first time, we feel nervous for him. And we can identify with him, and that's important. The antagonist is any other character that clashes with our protagonist. Antagonists have their own objectives, and your protagonist should have their own objectives. And when those two aims come together, they clash. So your story, you're going to need a protagonist and an antagonist. For example, a cowboy film, if you have a revenge cowboy film, our protagonist is going to be the man in the white hat. And the antagonist will be the local baddie. Maybe our protagonist wants to come and get some revenge. So once you have that conflict, it makes the drama more interesting. Your character can't stay the same. Bad films, action films, where the characterizations are quite weak, the characters never change by the end of the film. So for example, superheroes, they fight and fight and fight, and they win their fight, and then they leave, and they're still a superhero, and they haven't changed. But in real life, when you and I have a problem that comes up, we must dig quite deep within ourselves and battle with ourselves to overcome that problem. And so once going through that problem, overcoming that problem, we change. And it's the same as your protagonist. Like, for example, Frodo Baggins from Lord of the Rings. He's quite a boring character. He doesn't want to go on an adventure. But once he's in an adventure, he's learning how to sword fight. They're training him how to fight, and he must fight. So he becomes brave. And it shows him throughout the film getting more and more brave. So at the start of the film, he's a nervous, terrified little hobbit and a little bit dull. At the end of the film, he's brave and he's more exciting. So you see his characters change throughout that story. With your film, your character needs to start at one point and then change and become something slightly different because of the conflict that they've gone through. And really the aim is for them to be a better person at the end. And that's called the character arc. Character slowly changes from point A to point B. And they will, in theory, improve as a person. So think about your film idea now and your theme. Who is your character? Who are your main protagonists? And who are your antagonists? One more thing to say, your protagonist needs to be active, not passive. If he's active or she's active, it means they will lead their own story. So maybe they're a bit dull to begin with, but they do an action which starts the whole adventure off. Things should never happen to your protagonist. They can't react to a situation. They must be the instigator. They must start the action themselves. If you even think about Goldilocks, her decision was to leave the house. She ignored her mother and father and went out for a little stroll on her own and discovered the house and then went in the house. That's quite an active character. That's quite an active person. They decide, right, they're going to go out. They're going to go into this bear's house. If they're a passive character, they never would have left home in the first place. They would have stayed and listened to their mother and father. and who would have been happy with their boring life. But Goldilocks is a very active person. Same as Bilbo Baggins, you think about, he's decided, he will go. He'll go and follow the dwarves out on an adventure. He wants to be included on the adventure. When they first visit his house, he's not interested at all. But once they're gone, he wakes up the next day and he realises they're gone. He wants to be involved in the adventure, so he runs out after them. So that's an active character. He makes the actions, decides the actions that change things in his life. So I want you to create a character to do with your story. What does this person like? What don't they like? What's their problem with life? Why are they unhappy? What do they want to change? Try and think of a physical description. How old are they? What do they look like? Who are their friends? Are they married? Are they single? What happened to them in the past? Why do they behave the way they do? Once you start building that character, you can start adding things to them. You create a whole world around that character. And that's their backstory until they got to a situation now where they enter your film. They arrive there with wants and needs, and that's important. It's the same as you. You want things in life. You want to be happily married. You want your own house. You want a good job. Or you want to be left alone, It's your character. What do they want? Who are their antagonists? And what do their antagonists want? Why are these two people clashing? You need to describe your character in depth. I just want to add a little bit more on character and use an example. Previously we said maybe your theme is revenge and it's a cowboy film you're thinking of. Don't think of the obvious thing, like you see in lots of cowboy films all the time, similar characters. Try and make your characters a little bit different. So maybe your character is just a farmer, a simple farmer, and his wife perhaps was walking to market, and then the local bad guy robbed her and shot her dead. Maybe she's pregnant. So now you have a simple farmer who's enraged. His life has been destroyed by this single antagonist. So now that gives your character a reason to seek revenge. And also, revenge. Think about that theme of revenge and think about your own views on revenge. What's your opinion of it? Do you think that's the right thing to do, or do you think that it's really worthless? So, if he shoots the baddie, nothing changes in his life and his wife doesn't come back. Maybe that's your perspective. So maybe our farmer's in a dilemma, and an internal struggle, an internal conflict, while he's trying to seek his revenge. So externally he's angry, he's bought a gun, he's asked people where the bad guy is, and he wants to go to find him. Maybe everybody's saying, there's no way you can get to him. There's no way you can kill him. There's 20 guys surrounding him to protect him. So think about your character, your protagonist, and add detail. You need to really get to why your character wants that particular objective. It needs to be a good reason. And it also makes for a more interesting character. You don't want someone who's already a sheriff in a white hat and has all the necessary skills. That's a bit boring. Make your character perhaps even weak. Give them problems. Maybe he can't read, maybe he's an alcoholic. What's his background? So when we see him and we see him going, he's going to get revenge on the bad guy, we're thinking, no way. Now you've got a story. Maybe he's a farmer, he can't even shoot straight. How on earth is he going to kill the baddie? And that makes more of an interesting film. So structure. Every story has structure. Structure really means different parts to a story. Most films have the famous 3-act structure. That means that the story from 0 minutes to 90 minutes or 120 minutes is broken into 3 acts. Act 1, Act 2 and Act 3. Now your film is short, which means that Act 1, 2 and 3 will be short as well. But what you need is structure. Really, Act 1 is the same as saying a beginning. Where are we? Who's the person we're filming and what do they want? That's the sort of 3 questions answered. The second act is to do with the adventure, the journey. Your character's trying to achieve something or going somewhere, and there'll be conflict. And then the third act is really a resolution to everything that's happened up until that point. So in our film, they kill the baddie and win the day. And what happens after? Do they go back home? Do they start again? Okay. So if we think about Goldilocks and the 3 Bears story, look, I know it's a children's story, but it's good at showing structure. So Act 1, Goldilocks decides she's just going to walk out from her parents' house and go for a nice stroll. And then Act 2 is where all the action happens. So Act 2, she becomes hungry, lost, and finds the house in the woods. Now, remembering she's an active character, she decides actually she's going to go in that house and get some food. So she goes in the house, there's nobody there. She thinks, great, there's some porridge there, I'll have that. I'm a bit tired, I'll go to bed. Then some of the real action starts and the bears come home and oh my god, all hell breaks loose. So that's still Act 2. And then everything changes in Act 3 when she runs back home and she finds her way home. That's Act 3. So Act 1 is finding out who Goldilocks is and what she wants. And then Act 2 is the adventure. Finding the house, doing all the activities, eating the porridge, and also the conflict with the bears. And then when she escapes, it becomes Act 3. It's the resolution. She gets home. She makes it home safe, thank God. That's the resolution. And it needs to be the same in your film. You need to start with a setup. Who are your people? What do they want? Act 2 is them trying to achieve something, trying to do something, or going somewhere. And Act 3, they've achieved it and the issue is resolved, but what next? What happens to your character afterwards? So I want you to start thinking about your film in terms of parts. Act 1, very quick. Act 2, slightly longer than Act 1. And Act 3, fairly quick again. So we're talking about a 15-minute film, for example, really that works out at 15 pages of script. So, you could have 5 minutes Act 1, 5 minutes Act 2, 5 minutes Act 3, so that's 5 pages for each. Or you can make Act 1 shorter, 3 pages. Act 2, where all the action happens, needs to be longer, so we'd say maybe 7 pages. And then 5 pages for the resolution, Act 3. So that's the 3 parts. So I want you to start thinking about your story in parts. What happens to your character? You know your character now, they've got a lot of background, so how do we introduce them? What do we want? What do they want to achieve? You should understand that by now. Who are your antagonists? Who are they clashing up against? It doesn't have to be a person, it could be an entity, it could be a bank they're fighting, or maybe a court. It could be anything like that. It could be a person, but it could be a thing. It should be something that is at cross purposes to your character. And those cross purposes come together in a clash and conflict. If we go back to our cowboy film example, we have our poor farmer and his wife is killed. He loves his wife. They're soon going to have a baby, and then suddenly she's dead, and he's furious. He wants revenge. Buys a gun. So Act 1, we have what's happened to his wife. So they have a normal life, a normal family life, and then a horrible thing happens, which changes this whole world, and that change is the difference between Act 1 and Act 2. So you get to that point where his wife is murdered, and that is the change between Act 1 and Act 2. It's the change where everything changes. So in your story, things will be normal, and then pow, everything changes, and that is the point where your Act 1 becomes Act 2. The farmer wants to find out who killed his wife. He finds out who it is, and he thinks, right, I'm going to get my revenge. So now we're in Act 2. So the Act 2 is the farmer trying to find a way to kill the baddie. So maybe it's him buying a gun, or he's learning how to shoot. Maybe he can't afford the bullets. Maybe he's getting advice from his friends to help him. And that's his journey to go to the bad place, to kill the bad guy. And that's Act 2. And that's conflict. It's all conflict, conflict, conflict. Which means your character has these external conflicts and internal conflicts. You know, maybe it's a shootout with the bad man, or maybe it's a fight. But he's also going to have an internal conflict. So maybe he's thinking, I've got a son at home already. If I die trying to get my revenge, what happens to my son? So he'll have an internal conflict as well as an external conflict. And that's the thing that triggers our emotions as an audience. It's difficult. Once he starts that journey of revenge, it's difficult to come back to normality again. And he's probably having a huge dilemma about possibly dying. So that's an internal conflict. You know, is revenge wrong or right? Does God think it's wrong or right? That's what our character's going through. So there's external conflict and an internal conflict. And that makes much more interesting film. So for your character to know, for the audience to know what's going on inside your character while they're trying to achieve something. So you need internal character conflicts as external. I mean, there's a lot to ask for a 15-page script, I know, I understand. But it's important to have those elements. And I want you to think about your character going through those 3 steps, 3 parts. So I want you now to write a really rough, basic story. Half a page. And that's what we call the premise. For example, this story is about Tom, a poor farmer living in America, who's happy with his life. He's married, he has a son, and he's soon going to be a father again because his wife is pregnant. They're working hard, and then one day everything changes. A bullet flies through the air, kills his wife and his unborn child, and everything changes to Tom. Now he's furious. He wants revenge on whoever fired that bullet, and it's the bad landowner. Okay, that is your premise, and that's your basic story about what is happening, what happened to Tom, and that's a premise. So I want you to write a premise, half a page, that's it.